Welcome, folks. I see you starting to log into the webinar. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. I will be recording today, and then also we will be live on Facebook while we are in the webinar. I have disabled the chat function, so if you want to ask any questions, feel free to do so in the Q&A box. All right. Got just, I'll wait just one more minute. Let folks log into the webinar here. We just had a good number of folks registered today, so I want to give them a chance to get in if they're having any difficulty. I apologize if you hear any thunder in the background. It is raining here in Palmetto. All right, well, I've got 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Climate Smart Floridians webinar series. This is the 6th and final edition of this series. If you are interested in checking out the recordings of our previous sessions, we will be putting those up on our YouTube page. So you can look for Manatee County Extension and find our YouTube channel, and the videos will be available there. I'm also, I didn't do it for all of them, but for this and the last few, we do have them available on Facebook as well, because we are doing Facebook Live right now as well. So for anybody out there in Facebook world, this is a pre-registered webinar, so I won't be able to directly engage with you regarding your questions, but if you want to go ahead and type them in the comment box, I'll be sure to answer them after the presentation. I do want to give a quick opportunity to Kim Barber, who is with Manatee County Libraries, to give us an update on the libraries and talk a little bit about upcoming programs.
Thanks, Alyssa. Hi, I'm Kim. I'm with the Manatee County Libraries. Unfortunately, we are open to a limited capacity and we don't have any in-person programs going on right now, but we do have a ton of virtual programs and different online activities like escape rooms and puzzles. So if you go to the Manatee County Library website, you'll be able to find access to all of those virtual programs. Thanks, Alyssa.
Thanks, Kim. Yep, and we look forward to working with the libraries to do some more cross promotion for these types of webinar series as we move forward into this, mildly uncertain but hopefully optimistic future of online programming. Again, my name is Alyssa Vincent. I'm the residential horticulture agent here in Manatee County, Florida. Our office is located in Palmetto. And this is the Climate Smart Floridians webinar series. This is based off of curriculum that was created, and we'll talk a little bit about that by Florida Sea Grant's Climate Action Work Group. And before we get started, I do want to take a minute to just explain what Extension is if you're not familiar with us. For anybody who's joining us on Facebook who has never heard of Extension before, we are a function of the land grant university system. And here in Florida, there are two universities that are part of that system. There's the University of Florida, and there's FAMU, the Florida Agricultural Mechanical University. And the goal of extension is to take the research that's conducted at the university level and bring it into our communities in a way that is accessible and relevant to their daily lives. So our main mission is ultimately to enhance the quality of human life within our communities, and we do that by taking the research that's conducted and condensing it and making it relevant to our community members. And I do want to just highlight some of our local impacts from 2019. You know, over $2 million in value of new licenses and CEUs for folks in the landscape industry. $860,000 in value of volunteer time, and that's through, we have our Master Gardener volunteer program with over 109 individuals participating there who dedicate 10,000 hours every year to educating the community. We also have a 4-H program that has a robust volunteer program as well, and as a result of that 4-H youth development program, over 28,000 youth are educated through our office, and then over 14 million gallons of water saved to Manatee County Utilities customers. And so, you know, one thing that Extension does that I find to be really amazing is we really hit every facet of people's lives, right? We educate youth, we educate you about water conservation, both in the home and in the landscape. We work with marine fisheries, we work with livestock, we work with commercial agriculture, commercial horticulture. We're everywhere. And I think it's important for people to know that we're here as a resource for the community. So if you don't know us, get to know us, and I look forward to helping you in the future with any of your horticultural issues. Climate Smart, as I said, is a curriculum, a series of kind of learning objectives that was created by the Florida Sea Grant Climate Work Action Team. And the goal of Climate Smart is to increase climate literacy and to help folks find reasonable and achievable ways to reduce their local greenhouse gas emissions. And so today's presentation of Climate Smart, really, we're taking a deeper dive into the landscape component that we talked about in last week's class. So last week, we talked about water, and we talked about the ways that we use water in the landscape can contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And today we're really going to take a deeper dive into landscape issues and talk about both how our management of landscapes and or how our management of landscapes impacts potential climate change as far as the emissions of greenhouse gases, but also ways in which climate change are going to impact the landscape industry. So some of the key points that I want us to take away from today are that our landscape choices have a direct impact on our adjacent ecosystems. And some of those landscape choices end up having a direct impact on our broader global environment in the realm of greenhouse gas emissions. So, if we look at the photo here, obviously, lawn maintenance equipment, a lot of it relies on directly burning of fossil fuels in order for those engines to work. And so that's one kind of direct way that we can see that impact. The second point is that invasive plants, pests, and pathogens are more likely to spread as the result of climate change. And we'll talk more in depth about that. Plant species are shifting their climatic zones, and we're seeing this now. This isn't a, at some point in the future, we're projecting to see plants change their climatic zones. This is, we're finding plants in places we've never found them before. We can see that these climatic zones are shifting. And so that's going to change what kinds of plants can be grown where, what their blooming seasons are going to be, what kinds of pests are going to be attacking them certain times of year. That's going to have a lot of impacts on some of the landscape maintenance practices that we will have to do, and also on the nursery industry for knowing what plants can be grown where to be used in the different landscapes. And then, thinking about all the ways in which landscape maintenance is energy and resource intensive, and leading to greenhouse gas emissions, and not just in direct ways like we can see in this photo, but in some ways that may be less direct. So, what is the connection between landscape in your home and the broader, daunting Goliath that is climate change? And one of the biggest ways that our landscape choices kind of is integrated within this broader climate change framework has a lot to do with how we have shaped our landscape as humans as we've moved across the face of the planet, right? If you think about where we live, especially if you live here in Florida. We'll talk more about specifically what was here before you got here, but just in general, as humans have moved across the landscape, one of the first things we do is we clear cut, or we remove a lot of the vegetation. And then we kind of tame the environment around us. We bring in plants that are not native to the region. We make sure that those plants can grow and look beautiful by putting a lot of chemicals on them. And then we spend a lot of time and energy mowing and trimming these plants. So as we've kind of transformed the surface of the land, as humans have spread across the land surface, we have changed the land from what it was to what we think of as kind of a manicured yard or home landscape. Landscape maintenance can involve either the direct or indirect burning of fossil fuels. So, and what I mean by that is, if you think about a lawnmower, right? That's a really good direct example. You're putting gas in your lawnmower, the lawnmower burns the gas in order to mow the lawn. But what about the fertilizer that you're putting on your landscape, right? Fertilizers and pesticides come from some components that are usually extracted. In the picture here, this is an example of a phosphate mine. So you can have a very heavily energy intensive extraction process followed by an incredibly energy intensive manufacturing process. Then all of those components are transported to the location where you'll eventually buy them, and then you'll take them home and use them in your home landscape. So while you might not think so much about throwing out a bag of fertilizer now and then, thinking back down the line to where that fertilizer came from, you can recognize kind of the energy built into that system. And so it's highly energy intensive. And so we'll talk more about that, but that's kind of how those greenhouse gas emissions are wrapped up in those fertilizers and pesticides. The removal of native vegetation. So when we think about a site being developed, right, you'll have a developer will come in, they'll say, hey, this is a good high and dry plot of land. I'm going to come in, I'm going to cut all this stuff down, I'm going to burn it, and then I'm going to build. And then I'm going to throw down my sod and my kind of anchor plants and my street trees, and I'm good to go, and I'm walking away. And so the removal of that native vegetation releases CO2 because you no longer have that CO2 captured in those trees and in those plants that existed on the land surface. So you have carbon dioxide emissions associated with that vegetation removal. You also have disturbance of the native soil. There's a lot of carbon and other types of nutrients and molecules that are captured in the soil surface that during the disturbance, during the development process, those things get re-released and they're no longer stuck where they were. And then introducing plants that are not native to the region. So something, it looks pretty, it looks nice. And the most part, it has a similar function in the environment in that it photosynthesizes, it releases oxygen, but maybe that plant blooms at a slightly different time than the plant that would have been there normally. And then you end up having downstream ecosystem effects because of that different flowering time. So let's say there was a certain type of bird or pollinator that relied on that flower at a certain time of year. The flower is not there anymore. That pollinator isn't there. That bird can't eat that pollinator, and on down the line. And while we're talking specifically about climate change, I think it's important to recognize that one of the major concerns with climate change and with the potential impacts of climate change is the biodiversity impacts. So the ways in which climate and climate associated impacts are going to affect the current biodiversity and the available habitat for biodiversity in the future. So a study was conducted by the Center for Land Use Efficiency at the University of Florida, and it was determined that from the 4 main activities associated with lawn maintenance, right, irrigation, mowing, fertilizers, and pesticides, you can attribute approximately 79 pounds of carbon emissions per 1,000 square feet per year. So if you look at your land surface, your landscape at home, you can look at an aerial and you can say, okay, I have 1,200 square feet of lawn, and then you can attribute then what those potential carbon dioxide emissions are going to be associated with that use. Again, that this is irrigation, mowing, fertilizers, and pesticides. It doesn't take into account all of the associated impacts from some of our landscape maintenance activities. And just as a reminder, I put this image up. If you weren't in our first class where we kind of gave the background, the overview on climate, this just highlights the fact that the reason that we're concerned about these CO2 emissions is because they, keep the solar radiation closer to the planet, right? They don't allow it to bounce back out of the atmosphere, and that is what is increasing the temperature. And, for the most part, we like the greenhouse effect. We wouldn't be able to live on the planet if we didn't have it to some extent. But go back and watch the first one in the series, and I talk a lot more about kind of where we're at as far as climate change is concerned. So we've talked a little bit about how some of our activities on the landscape impact carbon emissions, right? We know that some of the resources we're using are highly energy intensive. We haven't even talked about irrigation yet and the energy costs of moving water, right? Because we talked a lot about that last week in the class that specifically talks about water, but water is very energy intensive as you move it. So there's a lot of associated greenhouse gases with the movement and treatment of water. So, you think about fertilizers and pesticides, you think about maintenance activities, transportation of resources, extraction and manufacturing of resources. There's a lot of kind of built-in emissions associated with those activities. But then also on the flip side of that, how is climate change going to impact what's happening in the landscape and agricultural industry? And something that we find when we start to look especially at agriculture is that we are already seeing lots of changes associated with climate change. And this is a really great infographic created by the IPCC. And it talks about how prices are increasing, the crop yields have been decreasing, there are some vulnerability analyses, and showing that that as this continues, people are going to be spending a larger proportion of their their available money on food goods because of the issues in the agriculture industry. And here in Florida, agriculture and the landscape industry kind of go hand in hand. We have a very large landscape industry here in Florida. And in fact, a report from 2017 showed that we can account about $22 billion in sales and over 230,000 jobs directly to the landscape industry here in Florida. So these are things like nurseries, think about everybody that installs sod. A lot of these are coming from sod farms where people are growing the sod, cutting the sod, transporting the sod, installing it, right? So you have all of this, and you have the folks that are going around and performing these landscape maintenance activities. So there's a lot of associated economic benefit here in the state of Florida because we have this large landscape industry. But when we look at what are potential impacts of climate change on this industry, we can see we're going to have changing rainfall patterns. We're going to have increased intensity and frequency of storms like hurricanes. We already have saltwater intrusion, sunny day flooding, and then the increase of pests and pathogens. So these are, insect pests that are not native to our area. They come here either, on accident from a plant that's coming over here for the nursery industry, or they come over here on accident in agricultural goods from another section of the world. But we get these pests here, and then because of Florida's very amenable climate, it's easy for those pests to sometimes take a foothold and cause a lot of problems for the landscape and agricultural industry. Pathogens as well, things like bacteria and fungus. And in fact, they're already seeing in some of the forests in the northeastern United States, the armillaria root rot, which is a fungus, is actually spreading its range northward because climate zones are shifting. So that particular pathogen has been able to shift its range much more north than it was ever found before. So, you think about things too associated with the people who work in this industry. So you think about a landscape company, and you have folks that are going out, they're planting material, they're trimming bushes, they're cutting the lawn, they are applying pesticides, potentially applying fertilizers. And you think about the associated health impacts for individuals that have to work out of doors in increasingly high heat and humidity situations like we're projected to see in Florida. In our area, that we're projected to see a huge increase in the number of days over 95 degrees. And so there are associated health impacts for the folks that work in these industries, as well as changes in the way the industry has to adapt to new pests and pathogens, and potentially a shifting in available plant material. I wanted to talk a little bit specifically about invasive plants and what it means for something to be invasive. And I think that there is a misconception out there. And so I'm actually going to ask for the folks that are here in the webinar, the pre-registered webinar, and folks on Facebook, if you want to type in the comment box, you can. What is an invasive plant? Go ahead and type it in the Q&A. What do you think is an invasive plant? I'll give you about 15 seconds. Just type it in the Q&A. Nobody knows. Okay, fair enough. I will tell you then what, oh, I got somebody responding. Let's see here. Okay. So a couple of the answers that I have say that it's going to impact the health of other plants, and that's absolutely possible. And that's one component of something that is considered invasive. An invasive species is never a native species. So, sometimes people will refer to certain plant species and call them invasive when what they really mean is that they're aggressive or weedy. One that comes to mind is Biden's alba, which is Spanish needle. It's the little white flower with a yellow center that grows pretty much everywhere in disturbed areas, right? Native, pollinators love it, but it is weedy, right? Pops up everywhere in your yard, and the little seeds have that little forked hooks at the top, and they snag onto your clothes and they ride with you. And so you end up spreading them everywhere. Right, so that's an aggressive or weedy plant, but because it's native, it could never be referred to as invasive. An invasive plant is one that comes from someplace else. It's what we would term an exotic or non-indigenous species, and then when it gets here, it is it's able to get such a good foothold that it starts to compete with our native species for resources. And in most cases, it outcompetes our native species for those resources and begins to develop things that are known as monocultures. A really great example of this is Brazilian pepper. Another good example is Australian pine, carrot wood, rosary pea, air potato. If you are from our area, you've probably seen some of these plants around. So where do these invasive plants come from? Well, in some cases, they have gotten here as the result of the nursery industry. Some of them were planted as ornamental plants on purpose, and then they escaped cultivation and have gone on to wreak havoc in our natural ecosystems. But I've gotten the question a lot, well, hey, they sequester carbon, they photosynthesize, why is this the problem? And the main reason that I can give for people as to why invasive plants are a problem is because they do limit the biodiversity of our peninsula. And so here in Florida, we actually have a really large number of endemic, meaning not found anywhere else, and native wildflowers, grasses, lots of amazing bromeliads. And we're seeing as these invasive plants come in, the problem is that they take away the resources from those native ecosystems, they outcompete with those native plants, they lower the biodiversity of the region, and then there are subsequent ecosystem effects. So remember we talked earlier that example of, okay, you have a plant that flowered at a certain time of the year. That plant's not there anymore. The pollinator doesn't visit it. The pollinator population declines. The bird or lizard population that ate that pollinator declines, and so on up the trophic levels in the ecosystem, and you end up with broad ecosystem impacts. So it's something to be concerned about. And the reason I bring it up here in relation to climate change is that the monocultures created by invasive plants change the nutrient cycling in those ecosystems, and they can have an impact on the microbial communities in the soil, which are very important for the capturing of carbon and other things in soils. And so with increases in days over 95 degrees, with these shifting climate zones, you can see this figure here shows you the shift in these climate zones from in the past 10 years and then over the next 30 years. And so as these zones start to shift, there are going to be plant species that come into our area that are not from here that have a higher likelihood of causing damage. And along with that comes insect pests and pathogens, like we talked about before. So it's important to recognize that, and let me go to the next slide. When we talk about how they get here, I really like to put this map up because it shows you that while here in Florida, we're this nice green color, right? This is a climate classification map of the whole world. Here in Florida, most of the peninsula is this nice limey green color. If you look for other areas that have similar climates to us, you'll find some areas in South America, some areas in Africa, some areas in Australia, Southeast Asia. And we tend to find that a lot of our highly invasive plant species come from regions that have very similar climates to ours. And as those climate zones shift and change, we may find more species from different regions of the world that are able to get a foothold in our region. And when we look at this from kind of an economic perspective as well, here in Florida, we have a lot of folks that are engaged in natural areas, land management. You can see that the economic return on keeping these species out of our area first is going to be much higher than trying to control and manage them once they're here. And so, kind of getting ahead of this, thinking about what kinds of plants we're using in our home landscape, being able to recognize whether or not a species is potentially invasive and choosing something else. These are all actions that we can take that can have an impact on this specific aspect of how climate is influencing our landscapes. So I want to pause and say, okay, we've talked about kind of the built-in energy resources. We've talked about the direct greenhouse gas emissions and the indirect greenhouse gas emissions associated with landscape. We've talked some about the broader ecosystem impacts from things like invasive species. We've talked about some of the economic impacts from things like pests and pathogens. So what are we doing right now? What are people doing? Are we what do our yards look like? And so I want to highlight kind of what was here before us. So in Florida, most of the peninsula is going to fall into a few broad categories of kind of ecosystem, right? We have flatwoods associated either with remnant longleaf pine or slash pine, dominated by saw palmetto. Sometimes they're wet, sometimes they're dry. Then we have wetlands, freshwater wetlands, and then we have estuaries, and then we have our coastal ecosystems. So you can see these are very specific, very harsh environments that have a lot of kind of requirements for the plants that can survive there, right? If you live out on one of the islands or right on the coast, you know that it's very difficult to get certain plants to grow, mainly because you have highly sandy soil, probably very low to no nutrient. You have salt spray, you probably have saltwater intrusion into your irrigation water. If you're living in an area that was or is surrounded by wetlands, you're going to have different challenges with the types of plants that can survive there. And then overall, we're dealing with a landscape that is generally very nutrient poor. And so in order to get some of our more desirable landscape species that are not native to thrive here, we have to do a lot of augmentation to the landscape. We have to add in a lot of resources. So that's energy in the terms of our time, right? Maintaining and managing these plants, but also from a fertilizer and pesticide perspective. So this is kind of what was here before us, right? Before humans came in and dominated the landscape, we were an environment here in Florida that was determined by fire, by hurricane disturbance, and by the flow of fresh water across the land surface. Now, what we have in a lot of areas are communities that were developed generally where we used to have flatwoods because those areas tend to be a little bit higher and drier than some of our other remnant ecosystems. So, you have an area that was dominated by pine that had fire running through it every 1 to 3 years, and then you you come in, you take the trees down, you burn the trees, you level the soil, you compact the soil pretty highly as you're running your construction equipment across the top of it. Then you lay down your sod, you put in your landscaping, you add your street trees, and you walk away, right? So this is kind of what we've got. And I think that there's a misconception from a lot of people who move to Florida from somewhere else that this is normal, right? This is what Florida is supposed to look like, right? You have a coconut palm and some Hawaiian Thai plants and a nice green lawn, and so I think that there's an expectation for that to kind of continue. And so I like to ask the question, why lawns? Because I understand the appeal of them in certain instances. They can look very nice. They are sometimes necessary for the type of wear or use that you're planning them for. For instance, for sports fields, right? You're going to need to have turf grass. You need to have a turf grass that can perform really well in that instance. Maybe you have HOA rules that require you to have a certain percentage of turf grass. But I like to think about, just kind of historically and what is the thought process behind having these monocultures of a green crop in your front yard? You don't eat it, but we spend a whole lot of time taking care of it and making sure it's the same height and it's nice and green. We put a ton of time and money and, as we talked about earlier, associated greenhouse gases into maintaining this, nice, short, green monoculture that we don't eat. And so some of the historical reasons why we have lawns are that they're associated with kind of the aristocracy of old Europe. And I think that we carried over some of this idea with us into the United States, where it was felt like you had to kind of show your worth or your wealth by being able to spend time and energy and money on a crop that you weren't going to eat, right? Everybody else has to worry about where their food's coming from. So they're going to take, if they have any arable land surface, they're going to grow food, right? Well, I can go ahead and just grow grass. I don't have to worry about my vegetables. So I think that there's some amount of that goes into why lawns are still kind of associated with, why they're so desirable. To a certain extent, people just want to maintain a certain level of aesthetic normalcy in their neighborhoods, right? You want to look like your neighbor's house. You don't want to be the oddball. You don't want to have your yard look way different than your neighbor's yard. You want some kind of uniformity. So that's appealing in some cases as well. There is a question about property value, and a lot of folks tend to think that nice, lush green lawns actually increase property value. And that actually has been found in most cases by the real estate industry to be not true. And that if you have trees on your property, and especially like nice looking trees that add some amount of shade, but you don't have a fully forested lot, that can add up to 20% to your overall property value. So I think that people are starting to think more about this. Why am I sweating at 7 a.m. to mow this lawn? And I think that's a good thing for us to think about and reconsider, but it's not the only thing, right? I don't want to kind of seem like I'm bad mouthing lawns, right? Lawns have a place, and in general, they're better than not having vegetation in that location, because they're providing oxygen, they're sequestering carbon, they're holding the land surface together. Grasses, in fact, are excellent at preventing erosion. So I'm not bad mouthing lawns, but I think that we can rethink kind of our relationship with them and think about what can we do in the landscape. What are the individual choices that we can make that are going to have an impact on our individual landscape footprint, but also potentially on the broader climate? And so I broke this down into 3 really simple steps, right? Water, plants, and maintenance. And we talked a lot about water in our last class, but I want to reiterate to use efficient irrigation. And this is a photo of drip irrigation, which is really it's going to be the most efficient type of irrigation that you can use because it's getting the water directly to where it needs to go on the plant. This is actually healthier for the plant in general because you're avoiding having a lot of water droplets on the leaves of the plant. And when you have water droplets on the leaves of the plant, it can actually facilitate the spread of bacterial and fungal pathogens. So, having that drip irrigation system is going to be really good for the plant in terms of keeping the water where it's supposed to be, limiting the spread of potential pathogens, and also you're lessening the impact of evaporation. So more of that water is getting to the place where it needs to go. Only water when necessary. I'm looking out my window right now and it's a deluge out there. I'm not going to need to water probably for a week because we're getting so much rain right now. I'm glad that we started to get our pretty much near daily rains because for a while there we were pretty dry and the plants were suffering in the heat. But really learning how to recognize when your plants need water. If you're looking at your lawn and the leaf blades are curled or slightly bluish, or you walk on the lawn and you can look behind you and kind of see your footprints, that's a thirsty lawn. That lawn needs some irrigation. But in general, this time of year, you can pretty much turn your irrigation systems off and just keep an eye out on the landscape. For most plants, once they're fully established, this is for other than turf grass, for a lot of your shrubs and even your perennial wildflowers, things like that, once they're established, you don't need to supplementally irrigate them except maybe during our drought season in the winter. So recognize when they need water, only water when necessary. Because remember, there's a lot of associated energy use with that water transportation and treatment. Right plant, right place. You're gonna hear this many, many, many times. Right plant, right place is going to let you put a plant in your environment that is more likely to survive without a lot of additional support. And so if you're if you're planting a plant that's a very thirsty plant in a dry, hot, and sunny part of your yard, that plant is not going to be happy. It's not going to thrive unless you are providing it with a lot of support. So right plant, right place. Make sure you know your site conditions and pick a plant that makes sense. When we're talking about picking plants, one of the things that I'd like to emphasize is try to prioritize native plants. And at the very least, find out which plants are invasive or potentially invasive and don't get those plants and put them in your yard. A really good resource for this is the IFAS assessment, and you can go to the IFAS assessment. It's a really simple web page. It has a search bar right in the middle when you get in, and you can type the common name or botanical name of the plant, and it will give you its invasive potential. It'll tell you this is no problem. It'll tell you this is probably a problem, or it'll say, hey, this one's definitely invasive. Don't plant it. So again, prioritize natives when possible, and at the very least, don't purchase invasive plants, don't put them in your yard, and find out which plants are potentially invasive. Encourage pollinators. This is just kind of my little sidebar because I think we need to do more to support the biodiversity of our local ecosystems. And one of the ways we can do that is by supporting the species that are lower in the trophic levels. And one of those kind of broad groups of species are pollinators. So if we plant a broad diversity of flowering plants, we're going to provide necessary habitat for pollinators. Think about your expectations and the expectations of the people around you. What is your aesthetic requirement? Do you have to have a neatly manicured lawn that has bushes that are in little boxes? If so, you need to find plants that can handle that kind of intensive maintenance. If you like bunch grasses and wildflowers and shrubby trees, then think about how that's going to impact your neighbors and whether or not there are rules in place that would prevent you from having such a landscape. In general, in neighborhoods that have HOAs, that have deed restrictions, you can find that information and find out kind of what your landscape restrictions are. But I would definitely look into that before you plant a whole bunch of plants and then you're disappointed when you have to take them out. As far as maintenance is concerned, one of the things I'm going to recommend is to minimize turf. So you may have a requirement to have a certain percentage of turf grass in your yard as a result of living in one of these, HOA neighborhoods or a deed restricted neighborhood, but make it the minimum. And the reason I suggest that is because, every square foot of turf that you have is a square foot that you have to water, fertilize, and mow. And so it adds to your maintenance and the associated greenhouse gases if you are kind of maximizing your turfed area. I would say also, this goes back to right plant, right place, but prune when necessary and not just because you think that you have to. And this is just for your own level of sanity, but also because it's energy intensive to go out and prune a landscape. Not all plants need to be pruned all the time. So look at your plant, figure out what your plant needs, and only prune it when necessary. And plant your plants for their mature size. And I say this because it's very easy to get really excited when you're planting your plants and planting your beds. But then very quickly, those plants kind of overgrow and overcrowd an area. And then you have to go in and spend a lot of time and energy spreading them out, dividing them, trimming them back. So really think about the mature size of your plant for the mature size. So if you know a plant is going to be 5 feet in diameter, then give it space to spread out to that size. Don't shove it in right next to a bunch of other plants just because you want kind of an instant effect. And I'm going to plug here that all of the things that we've already talked about are wrapped up in this neat encapsulated package that is the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. We talk about fertilizing appropriately, using mulch to conserve water on the landscape, reducing your stormwater runoff to conserve water in the landscape, recycling your yard waste to lower the associated greenhouse gas emissions with landfills and yard waste going to landfills. Right plant, right place, watering efficiently, right? All of these are principles in the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. And if you're not familiar with Florida Friendly Landscaping, we have a few different webinars that we've offered recently that will be up on our YouTube page very soon. And so I encourage you to go and check out our Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. And if you think your yard cuts it, then you can have us come out and check it out, and you'll get a nice fancy sign like you see here. So it shows all of your neighbors that you are thinking about your landscape impacts. So that was about all I had for you today. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. I do want to point out here a couple of good resources at our Manatee County Extension Office. We have our Florida Friendly Landscaping Program here in the office, has a program called Landscape Assistance Program. And this is where you can, you do a soil test in your landscape, and then you meet with our program coordinator and some of our Master Gardener volunteers to do a really deep dive into your landscape, talk about ways that you can improve your landscape practices. Maybe you need some plant suggestions for a certain problem area. They'll help you diagnose your soil issues if you're having soil issues. If you're interested in that program, reach out to Susan Griffith. She's our program coordinator. Her email is up here on the screen. And if you have in-ground irrigation in your landscape and you're interested in a potential rebate program that's offered through Manatee County Utilities, I highly encourage you to reach out to the Mobile Irrigation Lab. And the contact for that is going to be Michelle Atkinson. And she's our commercial horticulture agent, so she has a lot of great resources for other things as well related to the landscape landscape industry. And her email is there as well. The Center for Land Use Efficiency has a lot of really interesting information out there. They're the ones who did the research on kind of the main components of lawn management that lead to associated greenhouse gases, that carbon emissions figure that I cited earlier, the 79 pounds CO2 per 1,000 square feet per year. So I encourage you to check them out, see what kind of information they have. That was Dr. Jones, Pierce Jones, who put that original kind of study together. And then for the Climate Smart curriculum, if you're interested in Climate Smart, if you'd like to learn more about the Sea Grant Climate Action Work Group or why they did what they did, there are the contacts for the Climate Smart program there. And then here are a few references, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'll wait just a second to see if you want to type anything in the Q&A. And for folks that are watching on Facebook Live, if you want to type a question into the comment box, I will be sure to take a look at that after the webinar concludes, and I will get back to you with a response. Any questions? You're welcome. Okay, seeing no questions, we'll go ahead and conclude for the day, and I really appreciate it and look forward to upcoming webinar series that we're going to be offering with the libraries as well. We'll be sure to get that information out on social media when those are available. So thank you all and have a nice day.